Um, in folklore from both enslaved communities and from slaveholding families, story about the wonder, power, and efficacy of conjure are ubiquitous. You cannot study the folklore sources from both of these communities, both the white families, the slaveholding families, and the slave communities, without seeing stories everywhere you look about a voodoo doll that made a master hurt when the pins were placed, or about a man who was protected from lashings by some kind of supernatural mystery. Hence, the stories about conjure. So we're not just talking about conjure, but we're talking about the stories about conjure and telling the story you heard at the well, or somebody comes in from another plantation, maybe a slave has been bought and is brought in, and he tells the story about the wonders that a conjurer worked in his last plantation. The stories about conjure could build a protective wall and thus acted as a putative deterrent against slaveholder persecution. So a putative deterrent, putative comes from that same root as punishment, a putative deterrent. So if you have this story about the wonders of conjure as making you powerful in the face of this arbitrary and always threatening violence world that you are in, then the conjure starts to build a sense of a buffer around you and has an influence because the white folks are talking about this too. Everybody's wondering about how did it happen that that person survived that, made it through that? Why did somebody get sick right after they beat someone? Trying to explain what is happening was happening on both the white side and the slave side. They both understood that conjure was this kind of arbitrator between them, that the slaveholder doesn't want to be conjured. And the slaveholder knows that as long as the slaves have a strong conjure tradition, they will be braver. So it's very ambivalent how conjure was working as a bit of a buffer or wall or arbitrator between these two communities, still trying to make sense of how power is working between them. So here is the point with regard to sociological effects of conjure, in mediating the violence of the slaveholders and providing the enslaved with an indispensable narrative regarding their ultimate significance, their ultimate ability to stake out a claim as having some kind of power to protect themselves in a world of slavery. So there's a sociological effect of the stories and spiritual traditions of conjure, begins to build that wall, that buffer, that mediating place between the two communities. Now, she writes, it is clear that in many cases, supernatural beliefs serve to mediate relations between blacks and whites. Conjure also might have allowed black people to attain a measure of control over their lives as bond persons. So bond person, somebody who's enslaved. Allowed people to attain a measure of control, because if you can tell yourself you've got a measure of control, then you've got a measure of control. We understand psychology well enough to know that these kinds of elements of confidence, for instance, how that works for someone's success. So the stories themselves help them attain a measure of control. The world that the slaves inhabited was unpredictable and uncertain. And remember, if part of what you're trying to do is subjugate another people, one of your tricks is arbitrariness. You don't just daily at 7 o'clock that the beating will happen. If it happens oddly and arbitrarily and creates greater uncertainty, then nobody knows when the snap is going to happen. So, unpredictable and uncertain, anxiety over inevitable violence, separation from loved ones, or the unforeseeable risks of escape. If you're plotting that escape, the unforeseeable risks from the dogs that could come after you to the having yourself hamstrung. And you know what hamstrung means, right? It comes out of slave culture, that you cut that hamstring on the human, and they are not going to run anywhere with that leg anymore. They're going to have to flick the leg forward to make it work after that. Okay, so the unforeseeable risks of separation of escape must have engendered persistent insecurity for African American slaves. And that insecurity is part of how, just think, if you ask yourself, am I ever going to be subjugated? No way. Ask yourself what level of violence it would take against you and the people you love in order for you to accept domination. And that's the kind of violence that the slave holder culture figured out in order to repress and dominate. And so it creates a huge dimension of uncertainty, insecurity. Blacks also endure the ever-present realities of racial subjugation and other forms of affliction such as sickness and destitution. And we saw that with Equiano, and when he gets stolen again from another people and onto the ship, and that when he goes to this good master to buy his freedom, and the master is put it back like, well, I never intended for you to actually pay me $70. And if it weren't for his friend the captain, right, it's really likely Equiano wouldn't have come out of that conversation a free man. So those other daily afflictions. According to one historian of slavery, conjuring constituted a pragmatic and realistic method. Given a situation of extremely limited alternatives, that slaves could use to cope with their masters. And if you got very few alternatives, you will find what it is you do have, and you will work it. That is the nature of human willing. Nevertheless, slaveholders often found that the dilemma posed by Conjure lay not in the question of direct efficacy, that is to say, whether such practices worked against them, but in the ways that the slaves utilized these beliefs to challenge the slaveholders' authority. So again, the Conjure becomes this kind of wall, arbitrating, mediating, creating one kind of power happening here, and on the slave owning side, still all kinds of why did Nana get sick right after that slave got his foot chopped off? Did they just hoodoo Nana? Right? These questions of what kinds of power, supernatural power, are at work in our world is what people are looking at. In Conjure, the slaves developed an orientation, a conceptual framework to which their slaveholders had no access. Right? That's a great thing to have. When you are the underdog, you want code language. You got to have this world of stuff that the other guy can't get to. So you have your own lingo, your own dialogue, your own laughter and jokes, and you want the white folks to have no access to it in the case of slavery. And in which, because if they don't know the words, if they don't know the rituals, they can't control you in it. So you are creating that horizon in which you have significance. They developed a parallel world of meaning in which, via Conjure, they experienced themselves with a kind of power to protect themselves from the violence to which they had to submit daily. Two final quotes. Supernaturalism thus was an inseparable part of the composite of cultural practices that emerged in the context of the American slave experience. Right? So supernatural, if you're thinking about slave life, you cannot think about that life in an immoral universe without understanding the desire to gain access to supernatural power and a worldview in which you had a moral significance, you had some efficacy and agency in protecting yourself, in trying to keep the family together, in trying to heal the child who was beaten, etc. Finally, Conjure was invoked for all the pragmatic concerns of the day, from a desire for love to aspirations for wealth and freedom to healing practices. Quote, to believers, these supernatural traditions clearly served multiple purposes, but at the heart of conjuring practices lay a fundamental quest for power, explanation, and control. And whether you are on the white side or the black side of that wall of meaning, it's a fundamental quest for power, for explanation. What is the significance of being born into slavery? And control, some efficacy, some capacity to protect oneself and to garner that for which you desire. All right, so that should set you up beautifully to be able to hit chapter 2, where we learn more about the African origins that are part of slave culture. So thanks for listening.